10번째 테이프 마지막 강의 프로파일 두 번째 강의 계속합니다. The contentious Bennett has made no bones about using the office to preach. 이 싸우기를 좋아하는, 논쟁 좋아하는 베네트는 개의하지 않았다. 이 make no bones about doing something 하면은 뭐뭐 하는데 두려워하지 않는다, 개의치 않는다. 그러니까 이 논쟁을 좋아하는 베네트는 자기의 사무실을 갖다가 프리치, 즉 설교하는데, 잔소리하는데, 연설하는데 사용하는데 조금 더 개의치 않았다. 겁내지 않고 기탄 없이 두려움 없이 사용했다. This is the appropriate job for the Secretary of Education, says he, where your powers to say and be heard are much greater than your powers to make things be. 그는 말하기를 This is the appropriate job. 아주 알맞는, 적당한, 타당한 job이다, 일이다. 문교장관이 뭘 하느냐면은 라고 says 그는 말한다. Where your powers to say and be heard. 너의 힘, 권력이 말은 하기 쉽고 그리고 be heard, 들려진다. 물론 to be heard, to가 생략이 된 거죠. 그러니까 말하고 사람들로 하여금 네 말을 경청하게끔 문교장관이 말하면 듣게 만들기에는 아주 적합한 곳이다. 훨씬 힘이 더 세인데 무엇보다 더 세냐면은 than your powers to make things be. 이 너의 그 권력, 힘보다 어떤 힘이냐? to make things be. 어떤 일이 존재하게 있게끔 만드는 힘보다도 말을 하고 듣게 만드는 힘이 훨씬 큰 곳이 바로 이 문교부 장관실이다. 문교장관 직책이다. 그러니까 문교장관은 말만 하고 실행하는 것이 없다라고 이 비판적으로 말했다. 그 소리입니다. At the same time, he emerged as a formidable doer within the party. 동시에 그는 emerge, 서서히 떠올랐다, 부상했다. As a formidable doer. formidable은 그 만만치 않은, 아주 무시할 수 없는, 아주 겁나 보이는 만만치 않은 duo로다가 부상했다, 당내에서. 물론 공화당 내에서죠. 이 duo는 이 경우에 이제 실행자, 실천자, 아주 very active한 사람이다. 그러니까 이제 왕성히 활동하는 활동력을 가진 실행가로서 떠올랐다. When the news came out that Supreme Court nominee Douglas Ginsburg had smoked pot as a law professor at Harvard, Bennett made a critical call to Ginsburg, urging him to end his candidacy. 그런 뉴스가 나왔을 때, 즉 어떤 뉴스냐면은 더글래스 긴스버그라는 사람이 had smoked pot as a law professor at Harvard. 하버드 대학에서 그 법률학 교수 시절에 교수로서 이때 팟은 marijuana라는 소리죠. marijuana를 피웠다는 그 뉴스가 나오자 그는 곧 전화를 걸었다. Bennett made a critical call. 아주 비판적인 전화를 긴스버그한테 걸어가지고 urging him, 촉구했다. To end his candidacy. 그러니까 대법관 판사의 후보를 끝내라. 관두기를 촉구하는 비판적인 전화를 긴스버그한테 걸었다. Nor in recent months has he shown signs of easing back on either the frequency or muzzle velocity of his comments on education. 또 뿐만이 아니라 이런 것도 했다. In recent months, 최근의 몇 달 동안에 has he shown signs of easing back on either the frequency or muzzle velocity of his comments on education. 교육에 대한 그의 논평에 있어서 이 muzzle velocity는 그 총구 속도다 해가지고 총알이 총구를 떠나가지고 1초 동안에 가는 거리를 그 muzzle velocity라고 그러죠. 그러니까 최근 몇 달 동안 그는 그 조짐, 징조, signs of easing back, 좀 완화한다, 좀 누그러지는 듯한 조짐을 보여주지도 않았다. On either the frequency, 즉 빈도수, 비판하는 빈도수 또는 muzzle velocity, 양쪽 면에서 조금 더 누그러뜨리는 기색을 보이지 않았다. 이때 그 muzzle velocity는 아주 속도가 빠를수록 그 강한 거니까 강력한 비판은 물론 아주 자주 교육에 대해서 논평을 가하는 것을 누그러뜨리지 않았다. Some sample shots. 몇 개의 그 예를 들어보면은 이때 그 muzzle velocity라고 그랬기 때문에 shot이라고 그런 거죠. 그러니까 몇 개의 논평하는 그의 논평한 내용, shots. 이거를 몇 개 예를 들어보자. 이때 또 농담 나오죠. Oh, I get it. It's not okay for Ginsburg to break the law a long time ago by smoking pot and therefore be banned from public office. 인제서 이해가 간다. It's not okay for Ginsburg. 이 긴스버그가 to break the law, 법을 어겨가지고 long time ago, 오래전에 법을 어겼다. 왜 어겼느냐? 마리화나를 피움으로써 오래전에 법을 어겼는데, 그래서 그 이유 때문에 therefore be banned from public office. 공직에서 방해받아야 된다, 금지돼야 된다. 그러니까 베넷 문교장관이 즉각 전화를 걸었다니까, 오래전에 마리화나 핀 이유 때문에 공직에서 금지돼야 된다. 공직에 취임해서는 안 된다라고 자기는 전화하고, 그러나 but it is okay for Bennett to break the law by speeding while he is in public office. 그러나 자기는 문교부 장관이라는 공직에 있는 동안에 자동차 속도 위반을 해서 85마일로 달렸다고 맨 처음에 있었죠. 속도를 위반해갖고 자기는 법을 어겨도 괜찮고, 이 긴스버그는 오래전에 법을 어긴 것 때문에 공직에 취임 못하고, something doesn't add up here. 여기에 뭔가 말이 맞지 않는다. 이 add up이라는 거는 구어로 프레이즈로서 말이 된다, 앞뒤가 맞는다, 조리가 맞는다 그 소리죠. 그러니까 긴스버그는 안 되고 자기는 되고, 여기 말이 되지 않지 않느냐, 조리에 어긋나지 않느냐 그런 소리죠. Some sample shots를 보면은 star teachers all get salary increases. 이 아주 스타 교사, 아주 훌륭한 교사들은 all get salary increases. 봉급 인상을 당연히 받아야 되고, at the other end, throw out the incompetent people. 다른 한편으로는 던져버려라, 내던져버려라, 무능력한 people, 교사이죠. 이 경우는 무능력한 교사들은 쫓아버리고 축출해버리고, 훌륭한 교사는 봉급 인상을 하는 게 당연하다. They are killing the profession. 무능한 교사들은 이 프로페셔널을 죽인다는 건 이때 이제 교직계, 교육계를 갖다가 말살한다, 죽이는 사람들이니까, 그런 사람들은 해가 되니까 내쫓아라. 이때 또 빠른 농담 나오죠. Yeah, let's start by throwing out Bennett. 베네트를 축출함으로써 시작하자. He seems to fit the incompetent image pretty well. 그러나 아주 무능력한 이미지를 대단히 잘 보여주는 것 같다. 무능력한 이미지에 딱 알맞는 사람 같다. And he is killing the education profession. 그 사람이 바로 교계를 죽이는 게 아니냐 그 소리죠. Alan Bloom, author of The Closing of the American Mile, is a brilliant man, very good for higher education. 이 앨런 블룸이라는 저자다. The Closing of the American Mind. 미국의 마인드의 클로징, 종말이라고 그럴까요? 이 책의 저자인 앨런 블룸은 a brilliant man, 아주 훌륭한, 멋진, 빛나는 사람이다. Very good for higher education. 이때 higher education은 college and university education이죠. 그러니까 고등학부 교육에는 참 훌륭한 사람이다. But much too despairing. 그러나 너무 절망적이다. 절망적인 견해를 갖고 있다. He doesn't see the happiness and the spontaneity of American life. 그는 보지를 못한다, 인식을 못한다. 행복과 spontaneity. 이거 spontaneous는 이제 spontaneous의 명사를 해가지고 freedom, do what they wanna do. 미국 사람들은 자유를 좋아하고 아주 naturalness, 아주 자연스러운 거, 하고 싶은 걸 한다. 그러니까 미국 생활의 하고 싶음, 자유로움, 방임, happiness, 행복 이런 거를 그 사람은 보지를 못한다. I hate that prissy crap where he is anti-rock and roll. 나는 prissy crap을 싫어한다. 이 prissy는 아주 엄한, 꽤 까다로운, 아주 새침한 그런 소리죠. 그러니까 새침대기 같은 엄한 까다로운 crap, 쓸데없는 소리, junk 같은 소리다. 무슨 소리냐 그 소리죠. 이런 쓸데없는 소리를 나는 싫어한다. 어디에서? he is anti-rock and roll. 그가 반 락앤롤 음악을 반대한다고 말한 데서 그의 쓸데없는 아주 옛날 구식 같은 그런 말을 나는 싫어한다. Wait a minute. Bennett doesn't like Bloom because he's anti-rock and roll. 잠깐만. 베네트는 앨런 블룸을 갖다가 좋아하지 않는다. 왜냐하면 because he's anti-rock and roll. anti-rock and roll, 락앤롤의 반대, 락앤롤 음악을 반대하는 사람이기 때문에. But he doesn't like Ginsburg because he smokes pot. 그러나 그는 긴스버그는 마리화나를 피기 때문에 싫어한다. I think we are dealing with the frustrated hippie here. 아마 우리 여기는 맨 우측에 frustrated, 아주 좌절된, 욕구불만한 히피족과 우리는 상대하는 것 같다. 그러니까 이 경우에 frustrated 히피는 베넷 장관을 지칭하는 거죠. What makes me happy is seeing a good school and knowing more than all my critics. 나를 즐겁게 하는 것은 뭔가 하면은 아주 훌륭한 학교를 보는 것이고 훌륭한 스쿨들을 보는 것이고 그리고 나를 비평하는 비평가보다 내가 더 많이 아는 것, 더 많이 알 때, 훌륭한 학교를 볼 때 이때 나는 행복하다. 그 소리죠. Sorry, Mr. Bennett. As long as you are a Secretary of Education, you strike out on both counts. 대단히 죄송하다. 이제 자기가 그 훌륭한 학교를 보고 비평가들보다 더 많이 알 때 자기는 기쁘다 그랬더니 sorry. 죄송합니다, Mr. Bennett. 베네트 씨. As long as you are Secretary of Education. 당신이 문교부 장관으로 있는 한 you strike out on both counts. 이 strike out은 그 야구에서 삼진당했다 그 소리죠. 그러니까 실패한다. on both counts. 두 가지 면에서 다. 그러니까 훌륭한 학교도 볼 수 없고 훌륭한 그 너의 그 비평가들보다 많이 알 수도 없다. 그 소리죠. He has saved his real shockers for cabinet colleagues. 그는 save, 남겨두었다. save last dance form이 하는 거 있죠? 마지막 춤을 나와 함께. 그런 식으로 이제 남겨놔두는데 그의 real shockers, 그의 진짜 충격을 주는 말, 무서운 말, 충격적인 말들을 그의 그 강요, 캐비넷 컬리그, 강요 동료 장관들을 위해서 진짜 그 쇼킹을 주는 말은 남겨놨다. 즉, when an old friend, Justice Department spokesman Terry Eastland was fired by Ms. Bennett declared bluntly. 그의 그 오랜 친구인 법무성의 대변인인 테리 이스트랜드가 해고되었을 때 by Ms. 그 미즈 법무장관한테 해고되자 베네트는 declare 선언했다. bluntly 뚱딴지같이 갑자기 퉁명스럽게 발표했다. 선언했다. Terry Eastland's an excellent man. Terry Eastland는 아주 훌륭한 사람이다. He can join me at the department anytime. 오고만 싶다면은 문교성에서 언제든지 와서 나와 함께 일할 수 있다. 이렇게 이제 문교 장관으로서 법무장관을 비판하는 소리를 했죠. 이때 또 농담이죠. Along with all the other incompetent people on his staff who were fired from government jobs. 그래 그의 그 문교부에서 그 무능해가지고서 그 해고된 사람들과 함께 자기의 친구인 그 이스트랜드도 해고됐다 그 소리죠. With that stroke, Bennett distanced himself from the wreckage of the expiring regime. 그런 스트로크는 위에선 그 강한 말이죠. 일격. 그 일격과 함께 베네트는 distanced him, 거리를 멀리했다. 즉, 이런 사람도 있구나 하고서 그 좋은 인상을 받게 됐다 그 소리죠. From the wreckage of the expiring regime, 그 소멸해가는 레이건 행정부로부터 이 사람은 다른 장관들하고는 다르구나 이런 평을 받았다 그 소리입니다. He also began to establish himself for the future as very much his own man. 그는 또 역시 그 자신을 만들기 시작했다. establish. 그 자신의 상을 성립시키기 시작했다. 장래를 위해서 as very much his own man. 그 자신의 독특한 개성이 있는 사람으로서. Look, he told a reporter. 그는 이것 보시오. 기자에게 말했다. I put country above party. 나는 그 국가를 당 위에 올려놓습니다. 그러니까 나의 당보다도 국가가 우선한다. Always have. 난 늘 그래왔다. Then he added, I know that I'm popular with audiences out there in our country, and it doesn't seem to make much difference whether they are Democrats or Republican. 그리고 그는 부언에 말하기를, 나는 안다. 저 밖에 그 청중들, 즉 국민들이죠. 국민들한테 자기가 인기 있는 걸 안다. 그러나 그것은 상관이 없는 것 같다. It doesn't seem to make much difference. 그 자기를 그 인기 있어서 자기를 지지하는 사람들이 공화당이건 민주당이건 그건 상관없는 것 같다. As long as they don't complain about the quality of the education their kids are getting. 그들의 자녀들이 받는 교육의 질이 좋은 한, 그 불만이 없는 한은 상관이 없다. 그 소리죠. Bill Bennett may be leaving this administration, but when he says things like that, he does not sound like a man who has given up public service for good. 아마도 베넷은 이 행정부를 떠날지도 모른다. 그러나 그와 같은 말을 하는 거 보면은 he does not sound like a man. 그런 사람 같지가 않다. Who has given up public service for good. 영원히 그 공직 수행, 국민에 대한 그 봉사를 포기한 사람 같지는 않다. So what might lie ahead for him. 그래서 그의 장래에 무엇이 놓여 있을까? What might lie ahead for him? Right now, he says, 지금 당장 그는 말하기를 If I were gonna run for anything in the future, I'd wanna run for president. 만약에 미래에 언젠가 내가 그 어떤 공직에 출마한다면은 나는 대통령에 출마할 것이다 라고 그는 말한다. 이 정도로서 이번 타임집 2탄 강의를 모두 마칩니다. 그동안 끝까지 들어주셔서 감사하고요. 계속 반복해서 먼저도 말했지만 먼저 그 본문을 스스로 해석을 해보다가 안 될 때 본 강의를 들어보고 공부하는 방법을 택하시기 바랍니다. 대단히 감사합니다.
Preacher, teacher, gadfly. William Bennett is leaving as Secretary of Education, but his tart tongue and ample ego will keep him highly visible and audible and could well propel him higher in the GOP. It has been a dazzling bit of footwork, even for a world-class dancing man like William Bennett. Since he took office in February 1985, the brash Secretary of Education has turned himself into the most visible and surely the most audible member of the Reagan team. During the primaries, he flirted with various presidential aspirers who eyed him as a running mate. I dance with all the girls, he chuckled. So was he hungry for a higher office? I'm not running for anything, he said. Amid a riptide of administration defectees, Bennett held fast. Then on May 9th, Bennett told Reagan he was quitting in September to lecture and write. But no kiss-and-tell stuff. That's not my style, he growled. Bennett, however, has more than one agenda. He is consulting with the Republican Platform Committee as it prepares for next month's convention, where he will be a primetime speaker. Top Republicans have approached him about running for the Senate. He adds, after watching some of the people in the stakes for the presidency, I could do better than that. As a vice presidential candidate, I'm not sure I'd make a very good number 2 man, he retorts. I like to run things. No one who knows Bill Bennett, 44, doubts that. Nor has there been much doubt where he has been headed in the cross-country whirl that has taken him to 102 elementary and secondary schools in 3 years, plus scores of service clubs and state legislatures. Watch him as he visits number 88, the Amherst Middle School near Nashua, New Hampshire. The Amherst faculty beams as Bennett rumbles in, trailed by aides. He smiles, waves, pats shoulders, walking canted forward from the waist as though leaning into a wind. Bennett is a big man, 6 feet 2 inches, 216 pounds. A friend once pointed him out as the one who looks like a buffalo. Bennett is in Nashua to praise Amherst as a school of excellence, one that does well without begging for federal money. Insofar as people look to Washington for solutions, they're wrong, says Bennett. At these whistle stops, Bennett usually teaches a class, something his wife Elaine, an ex-teacher, challenged him to do. Get out and see if you can do it, she said. He can. Scrunching into a child's chair in an 8th grade English class, Bennett speaks softly. You don't want to scare him, he explains later. When the pupil questions become too rote, Bennett teases. Some kids ask me if the Secret Service was here. See that big guy back there? He says, pointing to a hawking bodyguard. If you guys make a move for me, you're in trouble. The kids love him. So does the rest of the school, which roars happily at the award ceremony. Then, running late, he makes a wild 85-mile-per-hour run to Concord to address the New Hampshire legislature. In Governor John Sununu's office, Bennett asked Senate President Bill Bartlett, "How long shall I do?" 3 minutes, says Bartlett. Plenty of time for some guy from Washington. Bennett guaps. He revels in this backroom camaraderie, the rough and tumble of what he is doing. It seems a grown-up version of the heavy contact touch football that Bennett loves to play on fall weekends, and may symbolize the life he would choose had he been born faster of foot and eternally young. Bennett plays the theme of frugal independence to these flinty lawmakers. The key to excellence is local control. You cannot spend your way to excellence, he says to approving nods. Then he is off again for a sprint to Boston's Logan Airport en route to a final flourish in Atlanta. Bennett seems to revel too in these dashes, riding the fast lane in cars, in conversation, in politics. He's got a big ego, and he knows it, says an associate. At Logan, Press Secretary Loy Miller tells him of an invitation from a TV talk show. Crossfire wants you Saturday, he says. Not Saturday, replies Bennett, a homebody who scorns the Potomac syndrome of working the restaurants at night. He snorts. A big status thing in Washington is 20 pink slips on your desk covered with stuff at 7:30 in the evening. My desk is clear. You work hard and then go to your family. He is adamant about skipping the Capitol's heavy poll bashes. Nobody ever says anything at those things, he grumbles. By reports, he has turned down invitations from George Bush. Bennett confesses he'd rather be home watching Dragon Slayer on the Disney Channel with Elaine and their son John 4. This close family life is precious to Bennett, a Catholic whose parents divorced 40 years ago, when pious folk did not. His mother, who disliked the rich and called the family us common folk, moved Bill, an older brother Bob, and their Hungarian grandmother from Brooklyn to Washington. There, Bennett flourished at Gonzaga High, a Jesuit school. The only guy in the honors class to be starting on the football team, he brags. But he chafed under the discipline of the fathers. They regarded me as a smarty pants, and they were absolutely right, he says. At the same time, he began to develop a ravenous ambition. At 17, he got into elite Williams College in Massachusetts. Grandma scraped together $200 for clothes. She knew there were a lot of guys from St. Paul's and Andover, and that I ought to dress up to speed, he recalls. At Williams, he got daily letters from her. She read all his major texts so she could trade notes on them. To help pay tuition, Bennett waited on tables and worked summers hauling furniture while earning honors, playing football and strumming a rock guitar, the very motto of the 1960s liberal student. Civil rights concerns nudged him toward the liberal Students for a Democratic Society, which later turned violently radical. But Brother Bob talked him out of it, advising that someday SDS might not look good on his resume. A resentment at privilege began to boil, and still simmers today. I really dislike snobs, he growls. Pretentious people who mistreat people who have to work for them. I hate them. This anger congealed into a hard-edged populism as Bennett took a Ph.D. in philosophy at the University of Texas, then served as a dean of liberal arts at Boston University, all under brilliant, acerbic John Silber, who was then undergoing a conversion from liberal to born-again conservative. Bennett refined his own convert's faith as director of the National Humanities Center in North Carolina, and then at age 38 as head of the National Endowment for the Humanities in Washington. At NEH, Bennett accused college faculties of a collective loss of nerve and faith for serving up trendy courses at the expense of classic Western studies. He spurned affirmative action quotas in NEH hiring, arguing that quotas were discriminatory. Mary Futrell, president of the powerful National Education Association, has called Bennett's record on civil rights less than exemplary. Bennett retorts, "If you don't think people should be given things or have things taken away on the basis of race or sex, if you believe that in 1965 you were a liberal, if you believe it now, you're a conservative." Bennett's style caught the approving attention of Attorney General Edwin Meese, who recommended him as Secretary of Education, the bottom-ranked cabinet slot. Bennett recalls, "The President said, I can't get rid of this department, but since we have it, I'd like you to represent the views of the American people and not the education interest groups." I said, "Fine, that's what I'd like to do." He has done so with gusto, greatly aggrandizing the position while so-called education interest groups, including university people and members of Congress, chafed at the notion that their own agendas were not of the people. Silber, who wanted the job himself, dismisses his protege as the sorcerer's apprentice. Bennett began by roasting college students as easy riders who beach-bummed on tax-supported loans. He then accused the Supreme Court of a fastidious disdain for religion, for banning use of public funds for remedial programs in parochial schools. He trampled on congressional toes with public calls for sub-basement education budgets, which Congress rejected, rather than tactfully negotiating compromises in committee. Reaction was quick and furious. Augustus Hawkins, Democratic chairman of the House Committee on Education and Labor, awarded the new secretary a failing grade. Connecticut's Republican Senator Lowell Weaker fumed that Bennett and his views should not be allowed out of the education building, much less outside Washington. So pervasive were the counterattacks that even the cocky Bennett felt abashed. "I underestimated the size of the microphone I had," he says. Bob, a Washington lawyer, offered some new big brotherly advice, says Bennett. He's got this big fish mounted in his office, and he said, "You know why that fish is up there? Because he opened his mouth, that's why." Bennett has since attacked the likes of Harvard for jacking costs above $12,000 with the help of federal student loan support, and for ripping off undergraduates with suffuse curriculums that Bennett derides as core light. He has detonated heavy controversy by advocating federal vouchers to finance parental choice among public schools. Typically, says opponents, white schools for white kids living in a mixed neighborhoods. He has called for AIDS testing of all marriage license applicants, hospital patients, and convicts, and has unloaded on Republicans and Democrats alike who oppose the president's Iranian and Contra policies. All that after Brother Bob told him about the fish. He sees a complex federal agency as a bully pulpit, comments Joseph Duffy, Chancellor of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and Bennett's predecessor at NEH. It is the temperament of a preacher. Hawkins has another, perhaps more canny perspective. Bennett gives the answers of a professional politician rather than a professional educator, a judgment some observers see as the sum of his many parts. The contentious Bennett has made no bones about using the office to preach. "This is the appropriate job for the Secretary of Education," says he, "where your powers to say and be heard are much greater than your powers to make things be." At the same time, he emerged as a formidable doer within the party. When the news came out that Supreme Court nominee Douglas Ginsburg had smoked pot as a law professor at Harvard, Bennett made a critical call to Ginsburg, urging him to end his candidacy. Nor in recent months has he shown signs of easing back on either the frequency or muzzle velocity of his comments on education. Some sample shots. Star teachers ought to get salary increases. At the other end, throw out the incompetent people. They're killing the profession. Alan Bloom, author of The Closing of the American Mind, is a brilliant man, very good for higher education, but much too despairing. He doesn't see the happiness and spontaneity of American life. I hate that prissy crap where he's anti-rock and roll. What makes me happy is seeing a good school, and knowing more than all my critics. He has saved his real shockers for cabinet colleagues. When an old friend, Justice Department spokesman Terry Eastland, was fired by Meese, Bennett declared bluntly, "Terry Eastland's an excellent man. He can join me at the department any time." With that stroke, Bennett distanced himself from the wreckage of the expiring regime. He also began to establish himself for the future as very much his own man. Look, he told the reporter, I put country above party. Always have. Then he added, I know that I'm popular with audiences out there in the country, and it doesn't seem to make much difference whether they're Democrats or Republicans. Bill Bennett may be leaving this administration, but when he says things like that, he does not sound like a man who has given up public service for good. So what might lie ahead for him? Right now, he says, if I were going to run for anything in the future, I'd want to run for president.